The story of Friedrich Nietzsche begins in a small town called Rücken, a place that sat on the edge of a river in Prussia. His father, Karl Ludwig Nietzsche, was a Lutheran pastor. He led a quiet life and loved to read the Bible. His mother, Franziska, cared for the home and kept the family close. Friedrich was the second of 3 children. His older brother, Ludwig, died when Friedrich was only 5 years old. The loss left a deep mark on the family. The boy grew up in a house where prayer and music were part of daily life. The church choir sang each Sunday, and the piano in the living room often played the hymns that Karl liked. The sound of those hymns would later become a memory that Nietzsche would compare to the echo of old ideas. At the age of 4, Nietzsche began to feel the weight of his father's expectations. Karl wanted his son to follow in his footsteps. He taught young Friedrich to read the Bible in German. The boy learned the stories of Moses, David, and the prophets. He also learned the moral rules that the church taught. These early lessons gave him a sense of order. Yet, even as a child, Nietzsche asked questions that did not fit the usual answers. He wondered why God seemed distant when the world was full of pain. He wondered why the church demanded obedience without asking why. When Nietzsche turned 9, his father died of a brain disease. The loss left the family without its main source of income. Franziska moved the family to Naumburg, a larger town where the children could attend a better school. The school was strict. The teachers demanded respect and obedience. They taught Latin, Greek, and the classics. The boy who had once asked simple questions now faced a system that valued discipline over curiosity. In the classroom, he saw how rules could control thought. He felt a tension between his inner questions and the external demands. A useful everyday picture can help see this tension. Imagine a teenager in a modern high school. The school has a dress code that says no hats, no bright colors, no jewelry. The teenager likes bright sneakers and a hat that shows his personality. He asks the principal why the rule exists. The principal says it keeps order. The teenager feels the rule is too strict. He begins to wonder if the rule is fair. Nietzsche felt a similar pull. The school's strict rules reminded him of the church's moral rules. He began to see that rules could be used to keep people in line, even when they did not serve a deeper purpose. Another everyday picture can help too. Think of a musician who wants to mix jazz with heavy metal. The music world has clear genres. Fans of each genre often resist mixing. The musician writes a song that blends the improvisation of jazz with the power of metal. Some listeners love the new sound. Others say it is wrong. The musician is breaking limits that were set by tradition. Nietzsche's early love of music, especially the works of Wagner, gave him a taste for breaking limits. He saw how a new sound could open fresh ideas. This feeling stayed with him as he grew. In 1864, at the age of 14, Nietzsche entered the prestigious Schulpforta, a boarding school in the hills of Saxony. The school was known for its rigorous academic program. The teachers expected perfect Latin and Greek. The students lived together, ate together, and studied together. The environment was strict, but it also gave Nietzsche a chance to read the great works of the past. He read Homer, Virgil, and the philosophers of ancient Greece. He also read the works of Friedrich Schiller and Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. The school's discipline shaped his mind. It taught him how to think clearly and how to argue. One historical anecdote from this time tells how Nietzsche once challenged a teacher's view of morality. The teacher, a man named Ernst, told the class that moral rules were given by God and could not be questioned. Nietzsche raised his hand and asked, "If the rules come from God, why do they cause suffering?" The class fell silent. The teacher could not answer. This moment showed how Nietzsche's early questioning began to push against the accepted ideas of his time. It also showed that the school, while strict, gave him a stage to practice his critical thinking. After finishing at Schulpforta, Nietzsche went to the University of Bonn in 1864. He wanted to study theology at first, following his father's path. However, the lectures of the professor of theology, Karl Wilhelm Friedrich Schlegel, made him uneasy. The professor emphasized the need for faith over reason. Nietzsche found the lectures boring. He soon switched his focus to philology, the study of language and ancient texts. He moved to the University of Leipzig in 18. There he met the famous composer Richard Wagner for the first time. Wagner was a rising star in German music, known for his powerful operas that combined myth and music. Nietzsche attended a performance of Wagner's opera The Ring of the Nibelung. He was moved by the drama and the music. He wrote in his notebook, "The music of Wagner is like a storm that shakes the soul." This early encounter with Wagner would become a key influence on his later ideas about art and culture. The first meeting with Wagner is another historical anecdote. Nietzsche traveled to the town of Bayreuth, where Wagner was building his own theater. He arrived early in the morning and saw the construction site. He walked among the workers and felt the energy of the project. When Wagner finally appeared, he greeted Nietzsche warmly. Wagner said, "You have a mind that can hear the music of the world." Nietzsche felt honored. This meeting sparked a friendship that would later turn into a rivalry. It also showed how a young scholar could be drawn to a powerful artistic vision. During his university years, Nietzsche also read the work of Arthur Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer's main idea was that the world is driven by a blind, irrational force called will. He argued that human desire is endless and leads to suffering. Nietzsche admired Schopenhauer's clear style and his criticism of optimism. He wrote in a letter, "Schopenhauer opened the door to see the world as it is, not as we wish it to be." This influence would later appear in Nietzsche's own ideas about the will to power, a concept that would replace Schopenhauer's will with a more active force. Nietzsche's early education gave him tools. He learned how to read ancient texts. He learned how to argue. He learned how to feel the power of music. He also learned how rules could limit thought. These experiences formed a base for his later philosophy. Yet some scholars argue that his early life did not shape his later ideas. They point to two main counterarguments. The first counterargument says that Nietzsche's major ideas came later in life, after he left the university and became a professor at Basel. They argue that his early exposure to school rules and music was just a background, not a cause. They note that many people study music or attend strict schools without becoming philosophers. They claim that Nietzsche's breakthrough came after he read the works of the ancient Greeks in a new way, not because of his childhood. The second counterargument says that Nietzsche's friendship with Wagner and his admiration for Schopenhauer were later choices, not inevitable outcomes of his early life. They argue that Nietzsche could have chosen any other composer or philosopher. They point out that his break with Wagner was as sudden as his break with Schopenhauer. The shift shows that his early influences were not fixed forces but options he later rejected. This view suggests that his early life was just a stage, not a shaping force. Despite these counter-arguments, many see clear links between Nietzsche's childhood and his later work. One real-world application of this link can be seen in education today. Teachers who notice a student questioning school rules can encourage that curiosity. They can help the student turn questions into deeper thinking. This mirrors how Nietzsche's early questioning grew into a philosophical method. Another application appears in the music world. Musicians who break genre limits often create new styles that challenge listeners. Nietzsche's love of Wagner's bold music and his later critique of Wagner's later work show how an early love can turn into a critical stance. Modern artists who start by admiring a style and later push against it follow a pattern similar to Nietzsche's. Modern interpretations of Nietzsche's early influences often use analogies. One analogy compares Nietzsche's mind to a garden. The garden is planted with seeds from his family, his school, and his early readings. The seeds of question, music, and language grow into plants that later become the flowers of his philosophy. The gardener can prune or water the plants, but the soil remains the same. This analogy helps explain how early experiences provide the soil for later ideas. Another analogy looks at a river. A river begins as a small stream in the mountains. It gathers water from many small springs. Nietzsche's early life is like those springs. The streams of his family, school, and early mentors flow together. As the river moves downstream, it becomes larger and can carve new valleys. The early streams shape the direction of the river, even if the river later changes its course. This picture shows how early life can still matter even when later ideas seem different. In Nietzsche's own words, the impact of early life can be felt. He wrote in O Ecce Homo, a later work, "My childhood was the seed of my thought." He also said in Thought Beyond Good and Evil, "All great thoughts begin in the heart of a child who asks why." These quotes show that Nietzsche himself saw his early years as important. To see how his early influences appear in his later philosophy, one can look at the concept of master-slave morality. On the genealogy of morals, Nietzsche argues that moral rules are created by those in power to control the weak. This idea echoes his experience in school, where teachers set rules that the students had to follow. The teenager who questions school rules can be seen as the early version of the master-slave critique. The teenager asks why the rule exists and sees that it serves the teachers, not the students. Nietzsche later expands this idea to society at large. Another example is his idea of the will to power. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, he writes, "The will to power is the deepest drive in all living things." This idea grew from his early love of Wagner's powerful music. Wagner's operas were full of strong emotions and dramatic forces. Nietzsche felt the music as a force that moved him. He later turned that feeling into a philosophical claim that all life seeks to grow and dominate. The musician who breaks genre limits shows a similar drive. He wants to push his art beyond the limits set by tradition. This drive mirrors Nietzsche's will to power. The story of Nietzsche's early life also includes a moment when he walked through the city of Basel as a young professor. He taught classical philology at the University of Basel from 1869 to 1879. In his first lecture, he stood before a group of students and said, "We will read the Greeks not as dead texts, but as living voices." This moment shows how his early study of ancient languages turned into a new way of looking at the past. He wanted to hear the voices, not just see the words. This approach later became a hallmark of his philosophy, where he tried to hear the voice of life behind the words of morality. The story of Friedrich Nietzsche's will to power begins with a simple question. What makes a person move forward, reach out, and become more than what they are at the moment? Nietzsche did not think the answer lay in a fixed set of rules or in a divine plan. He saw a force inside every living thing that pushes it to grow, to change, to assert itself. He called that force the will to power. In plain language, it is the drive to expand one's abilities, to overcome obstacles, and to shape one's own life. It is not simply a desire to dominate others. It is a deeper urge to become stronger, more creative, and more alive. To see the idea in action, imagine a small plant in a garden. The plant does not think about ruling the garden or crushing the weeds. It only reaches toward the sun, stretches its stem, and opens its leaves. The plant's growth is a tiny example of the will to power. The plant wants more light, more water, more space to live. Each new leaf is a small victory over the limits that surround it. In the same way, A child learning to ride a bike feels the pull of the will to power. The child does not aim to impress every passerby. The child simply wants to stay upright, to pedal farther, to feel the wind on the face. Each wobble is a test. Each successful ride is a step toward a stronger self. Nietzsche wrote about this force in many of his books. In Pull Beyond Good and Evil he said, "Life itself is will to power, and nothing else." He meant that every action, every thought, every feeling is an expression of this inner drive. When a painter chooses a new color, when a scientist designs a new experiment, when a lover opens a heart, each act is a move toward a higher version of the self. The will to power is the engine that makes change possible. The idea also appears in a short note Nietzsche sent to his friend Paul Ray in 1882. He wrote, "All that is great in the world is the will to power." The note shows that Nietzsche saw the same force at work in art, in politics, in love, and even in the rise and fall of nations. He did not think the will to power was a moral rule. He thought it was a description of how life works. Later in the series, the discussion will turn to how this force shapes Nietzsche's view of morality. The connection is clear. If life is a constant push to grow, then moral codes that demand self-sacrifice may be seen as obstacles to that growth. The next part of the series will also explore the concept of the Übermensch, the person who fully embraces the will to power and creates new values. For now, the focus stays on what the will to power means in everyday life. One way to picture the will to power is to think of a river. A river does not try to rule the land it passes. It simply flows, carving a path, pushing rocks aside, and finding new routes when blocked. The river's energy is not about beating other rivers. It is about moving forward, shaping the world, and becoming larger. Nietzsche used similar images when he spoke of the eternal recurrence, the idea that life repeats itself, and each repetition offers a chance to become stronger. The river image helps keep the idea grounded in something familiar. Nietzsche's own life gives a vivid illustration of the will to power in action. In 1870, when the Franco-Prussian War broke out, he was a young professor in Basel. The news of war reached him as a clash of nations, but his reaction was not to cheer for one side or the other. Instead, he felt the conflict as a test of his own inner strength. He wrote in a diary entry, "The war shows the world that power is not a static thing. It moves, it reshapes, it forces each person to confront what they truly are." The war forced him to examine his own values, to question the prevailing moral ideas of his time, and to push his thinking into new directions. This personal response mirrors the way the will to power works. An external event becomes a catalyst for inner growth. Another personal story involves Nietzsche's intense correspondence with the writer and intellectual Lou Salome. In 1882, Nietzsche sent a long letter to Salome, expressing admiration and a desire to share his ideas. He wrote, "I feel a strong urge to be close to you, not to dominate you, but to grow together in thought." Their exchange was full of passionate debate, moments of deep connection, and also sharp disagreement. Salome challenged Nietzsche's views, and Nietzsche responded by sharpening his own arguments. The letters show the will to power as a collaborative force as well as a solitary one. It is a drive that can push two minds to higher levels when they meet, not a simple desire to control the other person. Critics have raised concerns that the will to power can be twisted into a justification for selfishness. One argument says that if every action is seen as an expression of personal power, then caring for others might be dismissed as merely a way to feel good about oneself. In this view, the will to power becomes an excuse for egoism. A second criticism points out that the idea could be used by political leaders to rationalize aggression. If a ruler claims that expanding territory is simply the natural will to power, then war might be framed as a natural process rather than a moral choice. These objections highlight the danger of taking the concept out of context. Nietzsche himself addressed these worries, though not always in direct language. In On the Genealogy of Morals, he warned that the slave morality that praises meekness and self-denial can be a way for the weak to hide their own lack of power. He suggested that true strength comes from creating one's own values, not from following a set of rules handed down by others. He wrote, "He who has a why to live can bear almost anyhow." This quote, often shortened to "what does not kill me makes me stronger," shows that the will to power is about resilience, not about stepping on others. A practical example of the will to power can be seen in modern education. A student who struggles with math may feel frustrated, but the inner drive to understand the problem pushes the student to practice, to ask questions, and eventually to solve the equation. The student is not trying to prove superiority over classmates. The student simply wants to master a skill, to feel competent, to expand personal ability. The will to power is at work in the quiet moments of study, in the patience required to solve a difficult puzzle, in the satisfaction of finally seeing a solution. Another modern example appears in the world of sports. A runner training for a marathon does not set out to crush every other runner on the day of the race. The runner trains because the body wants to go farther, because the mind wants to test its limits. Each early morning run, each sore muscle, each moment of doubt is a small battle that the runner wins by pushing forward. The will to power turns the act of running into a personal story of growth. These everyday scenes help keep the idea grounded. The will to power is not a distant theory for scholars only. It is a pattern that can be seen in a child learning to tie shoes, in a gardener pruning a rose bush, in an artist mixing colors on a canvas. In each case, there is a drive to improve, to become more, to shape the world in a small way. When Nietzsche talks about the will to power, he also hints at a deeper layer of meaning. He says that the will to power is the fundamental instinct of life. In other words, the urge to grow is built into the very nature of living things. This instinct is not a moral rule, but a description of how life tends to act. It is like a compass that points toward change, not a map that tells exactly where to go. The concept also links to Nietzsche's later idea of the Übermensch, a person who fully embraces the will to power and creates new values. The Übermensch is not a tyrant. He is someone who has turned the inner drive into a creative force that benefits the whole community. In later sections, the series will examine how the Übermensch can serve as a model for a future that balances personal growth with social responsibility. To understand the will to power, it can help to think of a simple game of building blocks. A child stacks one block on top of another. Each new block makes the tower taller, but also makes it less stable. The child must find a way to keep the tower from falling. The child learns to balance, to adjust, to think ahead. The desire to make the tower higher is the will to power. The need to keep it standing shows that the drive must work with limits. Nietzsche recognized that the will to power always meets resistance. That resistance is what makes growth meaningful. Historical anecdotes give more texture to the idea. In 1889, while staying in Turin, Nietzsche experienced a mental collapse that left him unable to write for the rest of his life. Some scholars say that this collapse was a moment when his own will to power reached a limit it could not cross. Yet even in his silence, his earlier works continued to push readers to confront their own limits. The episode shows that the will to power is not a guarantee of endless success. It is a constant tension between desire and capacity. Another story comes from Nietzsche's early career as a classical scholar. He was invited to give a lecture on the pre-Socratic philosophers. Instead of delivering a conventional analysis, he used the lecture to argue that the ancient thinkers already sensed a drive toward self-overcoming. He claimed that even the early Greeks saw life as a movement toward higher forms. The lecture caused a stir among his colleagues, some of whom accused him of being too radical. Nietzsche's willingness to challenge the academic norms of his time illustrates the will to power in the realm of ideas. He was not trying to dominate his peers. He was trying to expand the conversation. The will to power also appears in Nietzsche's famous aphorism: "He who fights with monsters should look to it that he himself does not become a monster." This line warns that the drive to assert oneself can turn dark if it is not kept in check. It shows that the will to power is not a free pass to act without conscience. It is a force that must be guided by self-awareness. The warning fits with the earlier criticism that the concept could lead to selfishness. Nietzsche's own words suggest that the drive must be balanced with reflection. In everyday life, the will to power can be seen when a person decides to change a habit. A smoker who chooses to quit does not do it to prove superiority over others. The smoker does it because the body and mind want to be healthier, to feel stronger, to have more control. The inner urge to improve health is an example of the will to power at work. The change is a small rebellion against the old pattern, a step toward a new self. When the will to power is applied to societies, it can help explain cultural shifts. The rise of the internet, for example, can be seen as a collective expression of humanity's desire to connect, to share knowledge, to expand influence. People built networks not just to dominate each other, but to create new ways of thinking and living. The drive behind the technology is a form of will to power that reaches beyond the individual. Nietzsche's own writing style reflects the will to power. He often used short, sharp sentences, vivid images, and provocative statements. This style was a way to break through the complacent thinking of his readers. By forcing a new way of seeing, he exercised his own inner drive to reshape ideas. The style itself becomes a demonstration of the concept. Later in the series, the discussion will return to morality. Nietzsche argued that traditional moral values, especially those rooted in religion, often suppress the will to power. He called this slave morality, a set of rules that tell people to be humble, to accept suffering, and to avoid ambition. He believed that such values keep people from reaching their full potential. By contrast, master morality celebrates strength, creativity, and self-determination. The will to power is the engine behind master morality. The series will explore how these two moral systems clash and how one might move beyond both. The will to power also interacts with the idea of eternal recurrence, another of Nietzsche's famous thoughts. The eternal recurrence asks people to imagine living the same life over and over again, exactly the same. If a person can say yes to that thought, it means the person has embraced their own drive to become. The story begins with a family that has always gathered around a big pine tree on a cold December night. The children would hang bright ornaments, the grandparents would tell old songs, and the whole house would feel warm because of the shared belief that the holiday held a deeper meaning. One year, the parents decide that the old tradition no longer fits their new view of the world. They tell the children that the meaning of the holiday was never about a divine gift, but about human kindness. The ornaments are put away, the songs are stopped, and the night feels empty. The children notice the loss. They feel a quiet grief, not because the tree is gone, but because the story that gave the tree its power has been taken away. The family's experience mirrors the way Nietzsche announced that "Ward is dead." The phrase was not a joke about a literal death, but a description of a cultural shift. The old story that gave life its ultimate purpose was losing its hold on many people. The family's loss of a holiday tradition shows how a change in belief can leave a gap that must be filled in a new way. A similar scene can be seen in a small school that had a rule for more than 100 years. No student could leave the playground before the bell rang. The rule was meant to keep order and protect children. Over time, teachers and parents began to argue that the rule was too strict, that it stopped children from learning responsibility. The school board finally removed the rule. The children were suddenly free to go home early, but some felt uneasy. They missed the familiar rhythm of the day. The school's decision reflects the same kind of cultural shift that Nietzsche described. When a long-standing rule or belief disappears, people feel a sense of loss and must find a new way to give shape to their lives. Nietzsche first voiced the idea that God is dead in his book, The Gay Science. He wrote, "God is dead. God remains dead, and we have killed him." The words were meant to point out that the Enlightenment, science, and modern thought had taken away the old certainty that a divine being directed the world. The phrase became a signal that the old moral compass was no longer reliable for many. The impact of this proclamation rippled through art, politics, and daily life. It forced people to ask, if the old source of meaning is gone, what should fill the gap? The origins of the idea go back to the 19th century, when Europe was undergoing rapid change. The French Revolution had already shown that old institutions could fall. The rise of industrial factories changed how people worked and lived. At the same time, scientific discoveries, especially those of Charles Darwin, were challenging the idea that life was designed by a higher power. In the 1860s, public debates in cafes and lecture halls often centered on whether morality could exist without God. One famous debate in Berlin in 1865 saw a professor argue that ethics could be based on human reason alone. A clergyman replied that without God, there would be no ultimate good or evil. The crowd was split, showing that the question was alive in the public mind long before Nietzsche wrote his famous line. Nietzsche's own reaction to Darwin was complex. He admired the power of natural selection, but he also felt that Darwin's focus on survival left little room for the creation of higher values. Nietzsche wrote in his notebook, "Darwin shows the world as a battlefield of the fittest. I want to show the world as a field of becoming." He saw Darwin's ideas as a step toward the death of God, but he also feared that a purely biological view could reduce human life to mere competition. This tension pushed Nietzsche to develop his own concept of the will to power, the idea that life seeks to expand, create, and overcome, not just survive. The will to power became the engine that could drive people to create new values after the loss of the old divine framework. The proclamation, "God is dead," sparked many arguments. One argument said that the death of God opened the door for true freedom. Without a divine lawgiver, people could choose their own path. This view held that humans could become creators of meaning, shaping their own lives like an artist paints a canvas. Another argument warned that without a higher authority, society could fall into chaos. If each person makes their own rules, there could be conflict and moral confusion. Nietzsche himself warned that the loss of a common belief could lead to a period of nihilism, a feeling that nothing matters at all. He wrote that the greatest danger was that people would become passive, accepting the loss without trying to fill the void. Two counter-arguments defend the idea that faith still guides many lives. The first points to the continued growth of religious communities worldwide. In many parts of the world, churches, mosques, and temples still attract millions of followers each week. These people find purpose, moral guidance, and a sense of belonging in their faith. The second counterargument notes that even in secular societies, many people still turn to spiritual practices for comfort. Meditation, prayer, and ritual still play a role in daily routines, showing that the need for something larger than oneself does not vanish with the death of a specific doctrine. Both counterarguments suggest that the cultural shift Nietzsche described is not absolute. The human search for meaning can take many forms. Real-world applications of the death of God idea appear in modern politics. Some leaders claim that society must build new values based on human rights and reason rather than on religious tradition. In education, curricula often emphasize critical thinking over religious instruction, reflecting the belief that truth can be found without divine authority. In art, many creators explore themes of meaning without reference to a higher power, using the idea of the will to power as a source of inspiration. The idea also shows up in therapy, where counselors help clients find purpose by focusing on personal goals rather than external commandments. Modern interpretations of Nietzsche's proclamation often link it to the rise of existentialism. Thinkers like Jean-Paul Sartre and Albert Camus wrote about living in a world without God and still finding meaning. They argued that the absence of a divine plan forces each person to take responsibility for their own choices. In contemporary culture, the phrase, "God is dead," appears on t-shirts, in music lyrics, and on social media memes. These uses sometimes treat the idea as a cool slogan, but they also hint at a deeper question. What will replace the old story? An analogy helps to see the shift. Imagine a lighthouse that once guided ships at night. The light was built by a powerful keeper and was trusted by every sailor. One day the keeper leaves and the light goes out. The sailors must now rely on their own navigation tools, such as maps and stars, to find the shore. The loss of the lighthouse does not mean the sea becomes impassable, but it does require a new skill set. In the same way, the death of God removes the old guiding light, and humanity must develop new ways to navigate meaning. A second analogy uses a garden. For centuries, gardeners believed that a divine gardener tended the soil, ensuring growth. When the belief fades, the garden still needs water, sunlight, and care. The gardeners must learn to tend the soil themselves, understanding the cycles of nature. The garden can still flourish, but it now depends on human effort. This picture matches Nietzsche's call for the will to power, the urge to shape and grow, even when the old source of care is gone. Historical anecdotes illustrate how the idea spread. In 1869, a famous German newspaper printed a satire that showed a church losing its roof, with the caption, "Even the heavens have moved on." The article sparked laughter and debate, showing that the notion of a fading divine authority was already in public humor. Another anecdote involves Nietzsche's own break with his friend Richard Wagner. Wagner had built his operas around a mythic, almost religious vision of German culture. Nietzsche grew disillusioned, writing in a letter, "Your music once sang of gods. Now it sings of men who must become their own gods." The break highlighted Nietzsche's personal move away from a collective myth toward the idea that each person must create their own values. Nietzsche's reaction to Darwin's theory also became a public story. In a lecture in 1882, he told a crowd that Darwin had uncovered the corpse of God. The audience laughed, but some felt the weight of the statement. The lecture showed how Nietzsche used the scientific discovery as a catalyst for his philosophical claim. He did not reject Darwin's science. Instead, he used it to illustrate how the old metaphysical picture was collapsing. Linking back to the will to power, Nietzsche argued that after the death of God, the strongest force in humanity is the desire to grow, to dominate, and to create. This force is not just about physical strength, but about the drive to shape one's own values. The will to power becomes the engine that can fill the void left by the lost divine story. It pushes people to become artists of their own lives, to write new morals, and to seek new heights. Looking forward, the idea of the eternal recurrence offers a further challenge. Nietzsche asked readers to imagine that every moment of their life would repeat forever, exactly the same way, without end. He said that if one could say "why yes" to that thought, it would show a deep affirmation of life. The eternal recurrence ties into the death of God because it forces people to find meaning within the finite, recurring world, not in a promised afterlife. It asks each person to live as if every action mattered eternally, even when no divine judge watches. The story of the family losing a holiday tradition, the school dropping a rule, the debates of the 1860s, and Nietzsche's reaction to Darwin all point to one central theme. When a long-standing belief falls, people must decide whether to feel lost or to become creators. The death of God is not just a statement about religion. It is a description of a cultural moment when old stories stopped holding power. The impact can be seen in how families adjust celebrations, how schools rewrite rules, how societies reshape laws, and how individuals seek new sources of purpose. In the words of Nietzsche himself, he who has a why to live can bear almost any how. The why once came from God. After the proclamation, the why must be found inside, driven by the will to power, and tested by the idea of eternal recurrence. The journey from the death of God to new values is a path that each person walks in their own way, guided by the quiet voice of reflection, by the stories they inherit, and by the new stories they choose to write. The impact of Nietzsche's claim continues to echo in classrooms, in families, and in the hearts of anyone who wonders what to believe when the old light goes out. Nietzsche first introduced the idea of eternal recurrence in the late 1880s as a way to test a person's attitude toward life. He imagined a single moment, a single day, that would repeat forever without end. The thought experiment asks a simple question. If you had to live this exact day over and over, would you welcome it or curse it? The image of a favorite song on repeat helps to make the idea clear. When a song is played again and again, the listener can feel joy at the melody or irritation at the lack of change. In the same way, a commuter who faces the same traffic every morning can either accept the routine as part of life or feel trapped by it. Nietzsche wanted the listener to feel the weight of that choice. The roots of the idea go back to ancient thought. The Greek philosopher Heraclitus said that everything flows and that the same river cannot be stepped into twice. Later, the Stoics taught that the universe repeats itself in cycles. Nietzsche took those hints and turned them into a personal test. He wrote that the thought of eternal return is a great weight that can either crush a weak spirit or lift a strong one. The phrase great weight comes from a passage in which a demon whispers the idea into a sleeper's ear. The exact words are, "What if some day or night a demon were to steal into your loneliest loneliness and say, 'This life as you now live it and have lived it, you will have to live once again and innumerably many times more.'" The demon's whisper is meant to shake the listener awake. The concept fits with two other ideas that the video covered earlier: the will to power and the overman. The will to power is Nietzsche's claim that every living thing strives to grow, to assert itself, to become more. The overman, or higher man, is the person who creates new values and lives beyond the old moral codes. Eternal recurrence tests whether the will to power is strong enough to say yes to life, even when that life repeats without change. If a person can say yes to the endless loop, they are moving toward the overman. If they say no, they are still bound by old doubts and fears. One way to picture the test is to imagine a child learning to ride a bike. The child falls, gets up, and tries again. Each attempt feels similar, but the child's attitude changes. If the child looks at each fall as a chance to improve, the repetition becomes a source of strength. If the child sees each fall as a sign that the bike is useless, the repetition becomes a punishment. Eternal recurrence works the same way for adult life. It asks whether each repeat of a day can become a chance to grow, or whether it simply drags a person down. Nietzsche did not present the idea as a scientific claim that the universe actually repeats. He used it as a thought experiment, a mental tool. He wanted people to feel the pressure of the idea, to see whether their values could survive it. He believed that the test could reveal hidden strengths or hidden weaknesses. In that sense, the idea is more about inner life than about outer facts. The first counterargument is that the idea is impossible to verify. No one can prove that the world repeats itself exactly. Science tells us that the universe changes, that entropy increases, that new stars are born and die. If the world does not repeat, then the thought experiment is just a story, not a real condition. Critics say that using a fictional scenario to judge a real life is unfair. They argue that people should base their values on what can be known, not on a fantasy. A second counter-argument focuses on the psychological burden. Imagine being told that every mistake you make will be repeated forever. That thought can cause anxiety, fear, and paralysis. Some people might become so worried about making the right choice that they stop acting at all. In that view, eternal recurrence could do more harm than good. It could trap a person in a loop of dread rather than freeing them to create. Nietzsche answered these doubts not with data, but with a lived example. He often walked alone in the mountains of Switzerland. On those walks, he would stare at the same peaks, the same clouds, the same silence day after day. One winter, he climbed a high ridge and felt the wind sweep over the rocks. He said later that the view reminded him of the endless return of the same scene, and that the feeling was both terrifying and uplifting. The mountain walk became a personal rehearsal of the thought experiment. By confronting the same landscape again and again, he tested his own response to repetition. Another anecdote comes from a conversation with his close friend, Paul Rée. Rée, a philosopher who shared many of Nietzsche's ideas, once asked whether the idea of eternal recurrence could be a joke. Nietzsche replied that it was no joke, but a dangerous mirror. He told Rée that he had tried to imagine the thought while sitting on a bench in Basel, watching the same streetcars pass by. He said that the image of the streetcar looping back and forth forced him to ask whether he could love his own life enough to accept that loop. The conversation showed that Nietzsche used everyday scenes, a bench, a streetcar, to make the abstract idea feel concrete. Real-world applications of the thought experiment appear in modern therapy. Some counselors ask clients to picture their day repeating, to see what they would change. The exercise can highlight habits that cause stress, such as staying up late or checking a phone too often. By seeing the day as a loop, the client may feel a stronger urge to improve. In another field, designers of video games sometimes use the loop idea to keep players engaged. A game level that repeats with small changes can feel rewarding because the player learns to master the pattern. The principle is the same. Repetition can become a tool for growth if the player embraces it. Modern philosophers have taken the idea in new directions. Some compare eternal recurrence to the simulation hypothesis, which suggests that reality might be a computer program that could run the same code many times. Others see it as a metaphor for cultural cycles, where societies repeat similar patterns of rise and fall. In literature, the theme appears in works like Groundhog Day, where the main character lives the same day repeatedly until he learns to become a better person. The film shows how the endless loop can be a path to moral improvement, echoing Nietzsche's original test. An everyday analogy helps to lock the idea in the mind. Think of a garden that is planted, harvested, and replanted each year. If a gardener loves the garden, each season is a chance to refine the soil, choose better seeds, and enjoy the bloom. If the gardener hates the garden, the yearly cycle feels like a curse. Eternal recurrence asks each person to become the gardener of their own life, to decide whether each repeat is a chance to tend better. Another simple picture uses a kitchen timer. When a timer rings, it signals the end of a short period. If the timer is set to ring over and over, the cook can either feel rushed or can use the rhythm to stay focused. The rhythm becomes a guide, not a punishment. The same rhythm can be found in the breath. Inhale, exhale, repeat. People who practice mindful breathing learn to accept the loop of breath as a source of calm. In those cases, the loop is not a burden but a support. Nietzsche's own writing shows how he used the idea to push his readers. In No the Gay Science, he writes, "All things are return, the eternal return of the same." He repeats the phrase to hammer home the feeling of endlessness. He also writes, "You do not wish to be able to say yes to your life, even if it must repeat." The simple yes is the answer he expects from the Overman. The Overman says yes because the Overman has created a new value that can stand under any condition. The thought experiment also ties back to the will to power. If a person's will is strong enough to say yes, then the will has overcome the fear of repetition. The will to power is not just about domination over others, but about mastery over one's own feelings. Eternal recurrence asks whether that mastery can hold even when the world offers no new surprises. If the answer is yes, the will to power has proven its depth. Critics who focus on practicality argue that most people cannot live each day as a test. They point out that life includes illness, loss, and random events that cannot be controlled. The argument says that a thought experiment that ignores those variables is useless. Nietzsche might reply that the test is not about controlling external events, but about controlling the inner response. The test asks whether the inner self can stay steady no matter what the outer world throws at it. A second practical objection says that the idea could lead to fatalism. If everything repeats, why try to change anything? Some fear that the thought will make people give up on progress. Nietzsche anticipated this worry. He warned that the Overman must create new values, not accept old ones. The endless loop is a challenge, not an excuse. By saying yes, a person affirms that each repeat can be different in spirit, even if the external facts stay the same. In daily life, people already use a version of the idea without naming it. A student who studies for a test may think, "If I fail this exam, I will have to retake it next semester, and the same questions will appear." The student can either dread the repeat or use the chance to improve. The same pattern shows up in athletes who train for a race. They repeat the same drills day after day, hoping to become better. The discipline comes from seeing the repeat as a chance, not a curse. The story of a commuter stuck in traffic also illustrates the point. Each morning, the driver sits in a line of cars, listening to the same radio station. The driver can either complain about the wasted time, or can use the time to listen to an audiobook, to plan the day, or to practice breathing. If the driver chooses the latter, the traffic becomes a small part of a larger purpose. The commuter's choice mirrors the eternal recurrence test. Accept the loop and find meaning, or reject it and feel trapped. Nietzsche's mountain walks also gave him a physical sense of the loop. He once wrote that the same mountain ridge seemed to rise again each time he climbed, as if the earth itself were repeating. He felt both awe and fear. The awe came from seeing the same beautiful view, the fear from realizing that the view would never change. He used that feeling to illustrate how the eternal return can be both beautiful and terrifying. The mountain scene became a living picture of the thought experiment. The conversation with Paul Ray adds a social dimension. Ray asked whether the idea could be used to make people more moral. Nietzsche answered that the idea forces a person to look at their own actions without excuse. If a person knows that every act will be repeated forever, they cannot hide behind "it only happened once." The moral pressure comes from the imagined repeat, not from any external law. This shows how the thought experiment can be a tool for self-examination. A modern interpretation sees the idea as a prompt for sustainable living. If one imagines that the same climate conditions will repeat forever, then the choice to waste resources becomes a heavy moral weight. People who adopt that view may choose to recycle, to plant trees, to reduce waste. The endless loop of environmental impact can be felt as a call to act responsibly. In that sense, eternal recurrence becomes a guide for ethical choices about the planet. Another contemporary view links the idea to personal habit formation. When a habit is repeated daily, it becomes a loop. If the habit is healthy, like a morning walk, it can be seen as a positive recurrence. If the habit is harmful, like smoking, then seeing it repeat forever can motivate change. The loop metaphor helps people see the long-term impact of small daily actions. This practical use shows how Nietzsche's abstract thought can find a place in everyday decisions. The quote from "Thus Spoke Zarathustra" adds a poetic touch. Nietzsche writes, "All that is great in the world is the eternal return." The line suggests that greatness is found in the ability to love the repeat. The narrator can let the words sink in, letting the listener. The idea of the Overman, or Übermensch, first appears in the work that bears the name "Thus Spoke Zarathustra." In that book, Nietzsche writes that the Overman is the one who creates his own values, who looks beyond the old rules that once guided the crowd, and who stands as a sign of what humanity might become. The Overman is not a god or a superhero in a comic book. He is a human who has learned to shape his own life, to decide what is good and what is bad, and to live by those decisions. He does not wait for a church, a state, or a tradition to tell him what to think. He asks himself what matters, and then he acts. A simple picture can help. Imagine a chef who works in a small kitchen. The chef knows the classic recipes for soup, for stew, for cake. He can follow the old books and make a perfect dish that everyone expects. One day, the chef decides to mix flavors that no one has tried before. He adds a pinch of spice from a distant land, he changes the cooking time, he serves the dish on a new kind of plate. The result may surprise the diners, it may even change the way they think about food. The chef has created a new value for taste. He has not just followed the old rules, he has set a new rule for himself. In Nietzsche's language, the chef becomes an overman of the kitchen. A second picture shows a student in a university lab. The student has been given a list of projects that past students have completed. The list includes building a model bridge, writing a paper on a known theory, or repeating an experiment that already exists. The student looks at the list and feels that the work is already done. Then the student asks, what if I try to combine two different fields? What if I design a device that measures something no one has measured before? The student sketches a plan that blends biology and computer science, builds a prototype, and discovers a new way to track plant growth. The student has not simply followed the old assignments. He has set his own goal, his own value for what counts as useful work. In this way, the student acts as an overman in the world of ideas. Nietzsche ties the overman to another key idea: the will to power. The will to power is the drive that pushes every living thing to grow, to expand, to overcome obstacles. It is not just a desire for power over others. It is a deeper urge to become more than what one is now. The overman is the person who lets this drive shape new values instead of letting old morals force a shape on the will to power. When the overman says, "I will create my own good," he is using the will to power to rewrite the meaning of good itself. The critique of morality is the other side of the picture. Nietzsche argues that the moral rules of the past were built by people who felt weak. He calls these rules slave morality. They praise humility, obedience, and self-sacrifice. In contrast, master morality praises strength, creativity, and self-affirmation. The overman belongs to the master side, not because he looks down on others, but because he follows the inner strength that says, "Why decide what matters?" In this sense, the overman is a response to the critique of morality. He shows that values can be made, not just received. Historical anecdotes give a glimpse of how Nietzsche himself lived these ideas. One story tells of the moment when he broke with his original publisher, Ernst Schmeitzner. At first, Schmeitzner had printed many of Nietzsche's early works. Over time, the publisher began to ask Nietzsche to soften some of the harsher statements about religion and morality. Nietzsche felt that the changes would betray his own voice. He wrote a letter to the publisher saying that he could not allow his words to be altered. He then stopped sending manuscripts to Schmeitzner and found a new publisher, Ernst Kapp. This break shows Nietzsche's own commitment to creating his own values, even when it meant losing a convenient partner. Another anecdote comes from the summer that Nietzsche spent in the alpine village of Sils Maria in the Engadine region of Switzerland. He arrived there in 1881, looking for a quiet place to think. The high mountains, the clear lakes, and the simple life of the villagers gave him space to write. While in Sils Maria, he wrote parts of Thus Spoke Zarathustra, and the famous note that later became the aphorism, "What does not kill me makes me stronger." He also walked the trails with the local shepherds, listening to their stories about survival and the land. Those walks reminded him that the overman is not a distant ideal, but a person who can rise from any setting, even a small alpine village. The calm of Sils Maria helped him see that the creation of new values can happen in any quiet moment. Critics have raised two main objections to the overman idea. The first objection says that the overman encourages elitism. If only a few people can create new values, then the rest of humanity is left without a guide. The critic argues that this view can lead to a society where the elite claim the right to decide what is good for everyone. In history, such claims have often justified oppression. The second objection says that the overman is too individualistic. By focusing on personal value creation, the idea may ignore the needs of the community. A person who follows his own values might ignore the suffering of others, thinking that his own path is more important than shared welfare. Both objections have been answered by scholars who study Nietzsche. One answer points out that Nietzsche never meant the overman to be a ruler or a tyrant. He wrote that the overman is a goal for each person, not a rank to be given to a few. The overman is a personal horizon, a direction one can aim for. In this sense, the idea does not create a class, but invites each individual to become more authentic. Another answer says that the overman can still care for others, because the new values may include compassion, creativity, and responsibility. The overman's freedom to choose values does not force him to ignore the world. It can make him more aware of the world's richness. Modern thinkers have taken the overman into new fields. In psychology, the concept has been linked to the idea of self-actualization, the point where a person fulfills his or her potential. In technology, some futurists talk about the post-human as a version of the overman who uses tools to expand the mind. In ethics, philosophers discuss the overman when they ask how new moral systems can arise in a world where old religions lose influence. These modern uses show that the core idea still speaks to people who wonder how to live well when old rules no longer fit. Examples from everyday life illustrate how the overman can appear today. One example is a musician who refuses to play only the popular songs that sell tickets. Instead, the musician writes a new kind of music that mixes classical strings with electronic beats, creating a sound that no one has heard before. The audience may be confused at first, but some listeners feel a fresh energy that changes how they think about music. The musician has acted as an overman in the world of sound. A second example is a community organizer who sees that the usual ways of solving homelessness, temporary shelters and food banks, do not end the problem. The organizer decides to create a new model, a cooperative housing project where former homeless people become co-owners, learn new skills, and help each other. The project challenges the old belief that help must come from a charity that decides what is best. By setting a new value of shared ownership, the organizer follows the overman pattern. When the overman is compared with the will to power, the connection becomes clear. The chef who invents a new dish does not do it to dominate other chefs. He does it because his inner drive pushes him to try something new, to test his own limits. The student who designs a unique project feels the same push. The will to power is the engine that moves the overman forward, while the critique of morality clears the path by showing that old rules are not the only road. A famous line from Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra sums up the overman vision. Man is a rope stretched between the animal and the overman, a rope over an abyss. This line tells that humanity stands between what it once was and what it can become. The rope is thin, but it can hold the weight of a new future if each person pulls with his own strength. Another direct quote from Nietzsche's Beyond Good and Evil reads, "He who fights with monsters should look to it that he himself does not become a monster." This warning reminds that the power to create values can be misused. The overman must keep an eye on his own heart, lest he become the very thing he opposes. This quote is often used when people discuss the elitist objection. It shows that Nietzsche himself was aware of the danger of turning the overman into a justification for cruelty. The break with the publisher also shows a personal side of this warning. When Nietzsche refused to let his words be softened, he risked his own livelihood. He chose the hard road of honesty, even though it left him poorer for a time. This act mirrors the overman's choice to stay true to his own values, even when society pushes for compromise. In Sils Maria, the quiet mornings gave Nietzsche space to hear the wind over the lake. He wrote, "The higher we soar, the smaller we appear to those who cannot fly." This line captures the feeling that those who aim for new heights may seem odd to people who stay on the ground. The chef who adds strange spices may be called eccentric. The student who mixes biology with code may be called a dreamer. Yet both are following the same inner call. The critique of morality also appears in Nietzsche's early work on the genealogy of morals. He asks why people call certain actions good and others evil. He finds that the labels were set by those who needed protection. The overman asks the same question, but then says, "I will decide for myself." This decision is not a denial of other people's lives. It is a call to each person to think about why they hold the beliefs they do. A modern philosopher, Alexander Nehamas, writes that the overman is a self-making figure. He explains that the idea is not about being better than others, but about being true to one's own path. This interpretation helps answer the elitist objection. If the overman is a personal goal, then there is no hierarchy built into the idea. Each person can try to become an overman in his own way. Another modern thinker, Michel Foucault, used Nietzsche's ideas to talk about how power works in society. He said that power is not only something held by governments, but also something that each person can use to shape their own life. This view matches the will to power and the overman, because it sees power as a creative force, not only a tool for oppression. The overman vision also appears in literature. In the novel Steppenwolf by Hermann Hesse, the main character feels torn between his animal instincts and his higher aspirations. He eventually realizes that he can create a new self that blends both sides. This story reflects the rope image that Nietzsche used. The character's journey shows how a person can move toward the overman by facing inner conflict. In everyday practice, the overman can be a guide for people who feel stuck by tradition. A teacher who refuses to follow a rigid curriculum and instead designs a project that lets students explore real-world problems is acting as an. Nietzsche began his attack on traditional morality by looking at how people call something good or evil. He said those words are not fixed truths. They are the result of agreements that groups of people make to keep power. In the same way that children agree on playground rules, societies agree on moral rules. A child may say that stealing a toy is bad because the group has said so. The rule helps the group stay calm. In the same way, traffic laws tell drivers to stop at a red light. Those laws are not natural truths. They are rules made to protect the flow of traffic. Nietzsche saw good and evil as similar kinds of contracts. The idea that morality is a contract goes back to the ancient Greeks. The philosopher Socrates asked whether a rule is good because it is good, or good because the people say it is. Later, the Roman thinker Cicero spoke of natural law as something that exists beyond human agreement. Nietzsche read those old ideas and then turned them on their head. He argued that the natural law's claim hides the fact that powerful people have set the rules to keep their power. He called this master morality and slave morality. Master morality values strength, power, and pride. Slave morality values humility, kindness, and obedience. Nietzsche said that the slave morality grew when the weak needed protection from the strong. In his book, On the Genealogy of Morals, Nietzsche wrote, "What is called good is what is useful to the powerful, and what is called evil is what is harmful to them." He meant that the word "wohlgewohrt" was first used by those who could create values. Later, the weak turned those values upside down. They called the traits of the powerful evil and their own traits good. In this way, morality became a tool for the weak to gain power over the strong. One simple example helps to see this. Imagine a school where the rule says no one may speak unless the teacher asks a question. The rule gives the teacher control. It makes the classroom quiet, but it also stops students from sharing ideas. If the students later decide the rule is unfair, they may change it to anyone may speak if they raise a hand. The new rule still keeps order, but it gives more voice to the many. The change shows how moral rules can shift when the balance of power changes. Another everyday case is the traffic light. The rule that a red light means stop protects drivers from collisions. It is a contract that most drivers accept. If a few drivers decide to ignore the red light, they may cause accidents. The rule stays because the majority benefits from safety. The rule is not a natural law about stopping. It is a social agreement that works for most people. Nietzsche's view does not mean that all rules are bad. He recognized that some rules protect those who cannot protect themselves. This is the first counter-argument that many philosophers raise. They say that without rules that protect the vulnerable, the strong would simply crush the weak. In this view, rules like "do not steal from the poor" or "do not harm children" are essential for a fair society. Nietzsche would agree that such rules exist, but he would ask who created them and why. He would point out that the powerful often shape these rules to look like they protect the weak, while actually keeping the powerful's own interests safe. A second counter-argument says that some moral rules are based on empathy, not on power. Empathy is the ability to feel what another person feels. When people feel empathy, they may help others without thinking about power. This view holds that moral rules can arise from a genuine caring for others. Nietzsche would respond that empathy itself can be shaped by culture. He would ask whether the feeling of empathy is truly free, or whether it has been taught as a rule to keep the group together. He would still allow that empathy can be a real force, but he would caution against treating it as a universal truth. Nietzsche's own life gave him many chances to see how schools and books try to shape moral ideas. As a teenager, he attended the famous Schulpforta, a German boarding school that stressed discipline and obedience. He later wrote that the teachers there tried to turn every student into a good citizen by forcing them to follow strict rules. He remembered a lesson where the teacher told the class that truth is what the teacher says. Nietzsche felt that this lesson tried to hide the teacher's own power behind the word truth. He later described the experience as a crushing of the spirit. This anecdote shows how the school tried to make the students accept a set of rules without question. Another personal story comes from Nietzsche's early reading of the Bible. He received a copy of the New Testament while studying at the University of Bonn. He read the passages about love your neighbor and turn the other cheek. He found the language beautiful, but he also sensed that the text was full of commands that asked people to give up their own power. He wrote in a notebook, "The Bible is a book of morals that tries to make the weak feel noble." He saw the biblical commandments as a way to turn the weak into a moral community that could resist the strong. This reading shaped his later claim that religion is a tool for the weak to gain power over the strong. Nietzsche's critique of traditional morality connects directly to his famous statement, "God is dead." He said that when people stop believing in a divine lawgiver, they also stop accepting the old moral rules that came from that belief. In the section on the death of God, he explains that the loss of belief leaves a gap that people try to fill with new values. The critique of traditional morality is the first step in that process. Without the old rules, people must decide what to value on their own. The next step in Nietzsche's thought is the idea of the Overman, or Übermensch. This concept appears after the critique of morality. Nietzsche says that once the old rules are seen as contracts, a person can create new values. The Overman is the one who makes his own cultivate and level, not because of a group's agreement, but because he follows his own strength and creativity. The video will later explore how the Overman lives beyond the old contracts. Modern philosophers still talk about Nietzsche's view of morality. Some use his idea to argue that laws should be examined for who benefits from them. Others use his critique to support the idea that moral values can be created by individuals, not just by societies. In contemporary ethics, the idea that morality is a social contract appears in the work of philosophers like John Rawls, who wrote about a thought of ignorance to decide fair rules. While Rawls does not adopt Nietzsche's tone, both see moral rules as agreements that need to be justified. Another modern use of Nietzsche's thought appears in the field of psychology. Researchers who study how children learn rules notice that kids first see rules as ways to keep play fair, much like Nietzsche's playground analogy. They then learn that rules can also be used to control others. This observation supports Nietzsche's claim that moral rules are tools for power. To bring the ideas home, consider a simple traffic scenario. A driver sees a red light and stops. He follows the rule because it keeps everyone safe. If the driver decides to run the red light, he may think he is being free, but his action puts others at risk. The rule works because most drivers agree to follow it. This shows how a rule can be both a contract and a protection. Nietzsche would say that the rule is not a universal truth about stopping, but a human agreement that works for most. Now think of a playground where children decide that no one may take another's turn on the swing. The rule is made because a few children kept cutting in line. The rule protects the children who would otherwise be ignored. The rule is a contract that the group accepts. If a child tries to break the rule, the other children may stop letting him play. This simple story shows how a moral rule can arise from a need to protect the vulnerable. Nietzsche's critique also warns against taking any rule as final. He wrote, "There are no facts, only interpretations." This line reminds listeners that what we call good or evil is always seen through a particular point of view. The quote comes from his book, Beyond Good and Evil. He wants people to see that each rule is a view, not a universal law. Another famous line from Nietzsche is, "What does not kill me makes me stronger." He said this in Twilight of the Idols. The quote is often used to talk about personal growth. In the context of morality, it means that when a person faces the collapse of old rules, he can use that crisis to build his own values. The loss of the old contract can become a chance to become stronger. Nietzsche also warned that the herd The mass of people who follow the same rules without question can become a barrier to true growth. He said, "The herd forgets that it is the herd that makes the law." When people accept moral rules because everyone else does, they stop thinking for themselves. This idea links back to the earlier story about the German school. The teachers tried to turn the students into a herd that would obey without asking why. The critique of traditional morality also has a dark side. Some critics argue that Nietzsche's view can be used to justify cruelty. If all rules are just contracts, then a powerful person could claim any action is justified. This criticism is often raised by ethicists who stress the need for universal human rights. They say that some rules, like "you do not murder," must stay no matter who makes them. Nietzsche would answer that even the rule against murder is a contract that arose when societies needed to protect life. He would ask whether the rule is truly universal or simply a product of historical need. Another criticism points out that Nietzsche's focus on power can ignore the real suffering of the vulnerable. By saying that moral rules are tools for the weak, he may seem to dismiss the genuine pain that those rules try to heal. Critics say that the weak need more than just contracts. They need compassion. Nietzsche would likely reply that compassion itself can become a rule that the strong use to control the weak. He would suggest that true compassion should come from a free spirit, not from an imposed contract. The video will later explore how the idea of the overman can respond to these criticisms. The overman creates values that respect strength, but also recognize the need to protect those who cannot protect themselves. This balance is a key part of Nietzsche's later thought. In everyday life, the critique of traditional morality can be seen in debates over free speech. Some argue that speech should be limited to protect minorities from hate. Others say that limiting speech is a rule that gives power to the majority over the individual. Nietzsche's view helps to see both sides as contracts that serve different interests. The discussion can be linked back to the earlier example of playground rules, where the rule about no-name calling protects vulnerable children, but also limits some children's freedom to speak. Another modern example is the debate over animal rights. Some people argue that animals should have rights because they can feel pain. Others say that humans have the right to use animals for food because of human needs. Both sides are making contracts about what is good and evil. Nietzsche would ask who made the contract and why. He would point out that the contract often reflects human power over other beings. Nietzsche's critique also influences art and literature. Writers like Albert Camus and Jean-Paul Sartre read Nietzsche and took his idea that values are created, not given. They wrote stories where characters must choose their own meaning in a world without fixed moral rules. The influence can be seen in modern movies where heroes must decide what is right without a clear guide. The story begins with a teenager named Alex who sits in a bedroom filled with posters of bands. Alex feels the pull of a new song on a streaming service. The beat hits, the guitar riff rises, and a feeling spreads through the room. Alex thinks about joining a local garage band that plays loud, raw music. The decision feels more than a hobby. It feels like a call to become part of something larger, a rhythm that matches a deeper pulse inside. This moment mirrors what Friedrich Nietzsche called the Dionysian spirit, a force that breaks down the ordinary and opens a space for new life. In a nearby living room, a family gathers for a theatre play. The lights dim, the curtain lifts, and actors move in masks that hide their faces. The story on stage is ancient, full of gods and heroes, but the emotions are fresh. The audience laughs, gasps, and feels a tight knot in the chest. The family watches not just for fun, but because the drama seems to touch something hidden in each of them. Nietzsche saw this kind of experience as a glimpse of the Dionysian, a moment when the ordinary self dissolves into a larger, more chaotic flow. Nietzsche's love of music and drama was not a random preference. He grew up in a family that valued the arts. His father was a pastor who sang hymns, and his mother played piano. The young Nietzsche learned early that sound could move the soul. He later wrote, "Without music, life would be a mistake." That line appears in his early notebook and shows how central sound was to his thinking. Music, for Nietzsche, was more than entertainment. It was a way to feel the world's hidden forces. The idea of the Dionysian spirit first appears in Nietzsche's first major work, The Birth of Tragedy. In that book, he contrasts two forces, the Apollonian and the Dionysian. The Apollonian represents order, reason, and clear form. The Dionysian stands for chaos, instinct, and the loss of self. Nietzsche argues that great art comes from a balance of the two. When the Apollonian shape is too tight, art becomes sterile. When the Dionysian flood is too wild, art loses shape. The best tragedy, he says, is a dance between the two. A key anecdote about the birth of this idea involves Richard Wagner, the famous composer of operas. In 1868, Nietzsche, then a young professor, traveled to Bayreuth to meet Wagner. He arrived at the composer's house and found a room filled with scores, sketches, and a piano that seemed to breathe. Wagner greeted him with a warm hug and invited him to listen to a new overture. As the music swelled, Nietzsche felt the same surge he later described as Dionysian. He later wrote, "Wagner's music is the voice of the Dionysian." Their meeting sparked a friendship that would soon turn into a sharp break, but it also gave Nietzsche a living example of how music could embody a deeper force. Another anecdote comes from the time Nietzsche wrote The Birth of Tragedy. He was living in a small apartment in Basel, surrounded by cheap books and a single candle. One night, he read an old translation of Aeschylus' Agamemnon. The tragedy's chorus sang of fate, and the masks on the stage seemed to breathe. Nietzsche felt the ancient drama's power to shape the soul. He wrote in his notebook, "The Greeks knew how to let the Dionysian roar through the Apollonian mask." This experience helped him shape the theory that Greek tragedy was the first true blend of order and chaos. Nietzsche's theory of art is linked to his other ideas, especially the will to power and the eternal recurrence. Earlier in the series, the will to power was described as the drive in all living things to grow, to dominate, to create. Art, for Nietzsche, is a way that the will to power shows itself. When a musician writes a new chord, or a playwright crafts a scene, they are expressing their own power to shape reality. The eternal recurrence, the thought that everything repeats forever, also plays a role. If one must live the same life over and over, then creating something beautiful becomes a way to give that life meaning. A work of art can break the monotony of endless return by offering a fresh, intense experience each time it is encountered. The teenage band's story illustrates the will to power in action. Alex does not join the band just to play notes. Alex wants to shape how the music feels, to make a mark on the world. The family watching the play feels the eternal recurrence when they recognize the same patterns of love and loss that have been performed for centuries. The drama reminds them that each new performance is a chance to live the story again, but with a fresh heart. Nietzsche also wrote about the role of the artist. He said, "We have art in order to cure the sickness of our souls." The artist, in his view, is a healer who uses the Dionysian flood to bring people back to a deeper sense of life. The band's raw sound can be a cure for the boredom of daily routine. The theatre play can be a cure for the numbness that comes from too much order. Both are examples of art that does more than entertain. They change the inner landscape of the audience. However, not everyone agrees that art must have this deeper purpose. One counterargument comes from a popular critic who says that art can be purely entertainment. The critic points to blockbuster movies that sell tickets by offering thrills, jokes, and special effects. The argument is that if people enjoy the experience and feel good, the work has succeeded. There is no need to search for a hidden Dionysian force. The critic quotes a modern director. If the audience laughs and leaves smiling, the film has done its job. This view treats art as a product for consumption, not as a vehicle for existential insight. A second counterargument comes from a philosopher of the analytic tradition. He argues that art is a language that conveys information, not a spiritual force. He writes, Painting can be appreciated for its technique, its color balance, and its historical context, without invoking any deeper drive. According to this view, the value of art lies in its skill and its cultural significance, not in a hidden power to awaken the soul. The philosopher claims that Nietzsche's idea of the Dionysian adds an unnecessary layer of mysticism that distracts from the concrete aspects of art. Both counterarguments have merit. They remind the audience that not every piece of music or drama is meant to be a profound awakening. Some songs are meant to be fun, some plays are meant to be light. Yet Nietzsche would say that even these works contain a hint of the Dionysian, because they still break the ordinary flow of daily life. A pop song that makes people dance still lets the body move beyond rational thought for a few minutes. A comedy that makes people laugh still frees them from the weight of seriousness. Real-world applications of Nietzsche's ideas can be seen in modern creative practice. In education, teachers sometimes use music to help students feel more engaged. A teacher might play a fast rhythm while students solve a math problem, hoping the beat will lift the mind and make the work feel less rigid. This practice echoes the Dionysian idea that a burst of feeling can open new ways of thinking. In therapy, art therapists use painting and drama to help patients access emotions that words cannot reach. By encouraging a patient to paint wildly, the therapist hopes to let the Dionysian spirit flow, allowing hidden feelings to surface. Modern interpretations of Nietzsche's art theory appear in contemporary philosophy of aesthetics. Some scholars argue that the Dionysian is a metaphor for the way technology can disrupt everyday patterns. They point to virtual reality games that immerse players in worlds that feel chaotic and alive. The experience can be described as a digital Dionysian, where the player loses the sense of self and becomes part of a larger flow. Others see the Dionysian as a call to protect creative freedom in a world of mass media. They claim that when corporations control art, the Dionysian spark is smothered, and society loses its ability to feel deeply. An analogy helps to make this clear. Imagine a river that runs through a city. The river can be calm, reflecting the sky, or it can be a rapid that rushes over rocks. The calm water is like the Apollonian, clear, ordered, easy to see. The rapid water is like the Dionysian, wild, hidden, powerful. A good piece of art is a bridge that lets a person cross the river safely while still feeling the rush. The bridge must be strong, the form, and must also let the traveller sense the water's force, the feeling. If the bridge is too stiff, the traveller misses the excitement. If the bridge is too flimsy, the traveller risks falling. Great art finds the right balance. Returning to Alex, the teenager eventually decides to join the garage band. The first rehearsal is noisy, full of missed notes and shouted ideas. Yet, as the band finds a groove, the room fills with a sound that feels like a heartbeat. The friends in the band start to feel a bond that goes beyond the music. They feel a shared power to shape something new. This moment is a small version of the Dionysian experience Nietzsche described. The band's music becomes a way for them to assert their will to power, to claim a space in the world. In the family theatre night, the play ends with a chorus singing about the endless cycle of life. The parents notice that the children's faces are solemn, as if they have felt something deeper than the plot. The family leaves the theatre with a quiet conversation about fate and choice. The play has reminded them that their lives are part of a larger story that repeats, much like Nietzsche's eternal recurrence. The experience has given them a moment to reflect on how they might live each repeat with more intensity. Quotes from Nietzsche's own writing give voice to these ideas. In The Birth of Tragedy, he writes, "The greatest event in the history of art is the birth of tragedy." He adds, "Tragedy is the highest form of art because it unites the Apollonian and the Dionysian." In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, he says, "One must still have chaos in oneself to be able to give birth to a dancing star." This line captures the notion that inner disorder can lead to creative brilliance. In The Will to Power, he notes, "Art is the highest task and the proper metaphysical activity of this life." These statements reinforce the link between art, power, and the deeper forces that shape human life. The earlier discussion of the will to power highlighted how all living beings strive to grow and assert themselves. Art, in Nietzsche's view, is a special form of that striving. When a composer writes a symphony, he is not just arranging notes. He is extending his will into the world. When a playwright writes a scene, he is shaping how others will think and feel. The power of the work lives on after the creator is gone, echoing the idea of the eternal recurrence, where each performance repeats the same pattern, but each audience experiences it anew. Nietzsche also warned about the danger of turning art into a mere commodity. He said, "When art becomes a market item, it loses its power to awaken the spirit." This warning is relevant today, when streaming platforms push playlists that are designed to keep listeners hooked. The music may be catchy, but if it is only a tool for profit, the Dionysian spark can be dulled. The teenage band in the story faces this choice: to write songs that sell or to write songs that express something deeper. The decision will shape how the band's music influences its listeners. In the theatre world, similar pressures appear. A production may be altered to please sponsors, removing the raw edge that made it powerful. The family in the story may notice that a play they love has been softened for a broader audience. This change can make the experience feel less authentic, less Dionysian. Nietzsche would argue that such compromises weaken the. Nietzsche's writing style feels like a modern tweet or a quick meme. It is short, sharp, and meant to hit the mind fast. He often wrote a single line that could stand alone, like a headline on a news page. One example of a meme that captures his tone could read, "When you realize the herd is just a Wi-Fi network, connect to yourself instead." The joke is simple, but the idea behind it is deep. A newspaper headline that echoes his style might say, "New study shows moral values are not fixed. Ask the philosopher who said so." Both the meme and the headline use few words, but they push the reader to think about freedom and truth. The power of this brief style lies in its ability to linger. A single line can be repeated, shared, and remembered. It works like a hook in a song. Nietzsche used this hook to pull readers into larger ideas. He would place a short, bold claim at the start of a paragraph, then expand on it in the following sentences. The first line acts as a spark, the rest as the fire. In the book Thus Spoke Zarathustra, he writes, "What is great in man is that he is a bridge." That line can be quoted on a wall, in a text message, or in a classroom, and still carry its weight. Because the style is so brief, it can look like a social media post. A modern reader might scroll past a long essay, but stop at a short, striking sentence. Nietzsche seemed to know this before the internet existed. He wrote in a way that forces the reader to pause, to feel the words, and then to wonder what comes next. The short form also lets him play with paradox. He would say one thing and then turn it around in the next line, creating a tension that keeps the mind alert. For example, he writes, "Who has a why can bear any how." The sentence is simple, yet it opens a whole discussion about purpose and suffering. The use of paradox is a key part of his style. A paradox is a statement that seems to contradict itself, but on closer look, it reveals a deeper truth. Nietzsche loved to place two opposite ideas side by side. He would write, "The higher we soar, the smaller we appear to those who cannot fly." The line sounds like a poetic joke, but it also points to the loneliness of great thinkers. By keeping the sentence short, the paradox hits harder. The reader does not have time to smooth over the contradiction. The mind must wrestle with it right away. Some readers argue that this brevity can hide nuance. One criticism says that a short sentence may leave out important details, making the idea seem too simple. For example, the quote, "What does not kill us makes us stronger" sounds like a simple pep talk. Yet the full context in Nietzsche's work includes a warning about the cost of suffering and the danger of glorifying pain. When the sentence is taken out of its larger discussion, it can be misunderstood as a blanket endorsement of hardship. Critics point out that the short form can be misused when people share the line without the surrounding argument. A second criticism focuses on the risk of ambiguity. Because Nietzsche's sentences are packed with meaning, a reader might read one meaning and miss another. The line, "There are no facts, only interpretations," can be read as denying any objective reality, or as reminding us that we always see the world through a personal lens. Without the longer text that explains his view on perspectivism, the short line can be taken to extreme positions. Some scholars worry that the punchy style makes it easy for extremist groups to cherry-pick quotes that fit their agenda. These concerns do not mean that the short style is useless. Rather, they show that readers need to look deeper. The style invites curiosity. When a reader meets a striking line, the next step is to search for the larger work, to read the surrounding paragraphs, and to see how Nietzsche builds his case. In this way, the brief form works as a doorway, not a wall. Nietzsche's habit of keeping a small notebook helped him create this style. He carried a pocket-sized book wherever he went, often writing on the train, in a cafe, or while walking in the park. He would jot down a thought, a fragment, or a witty turn of phrase. One anecdote tells of a rainy day in Basel when he sat in a tavern, rain pattering on the window, and scribbled the line, "The snake which cannot cast its skin has to die." He later polished the fragment into a full paragraph in Science. The habit of writing in short bursts kept his thoughts crisp. He did not wait for a long, formal essay to form. He captured the flash of insight as it arrived. Another story about his notebook habit involves a winter night in Sils Maria. He stayed in a small hotel, and the fire crackled in the lobby. He wrote in his notebook, "When you look at the abyss looks back at you." He later expanded this into the famous line about gazing into the abyss. The notebook allowed him to preserve the raw image, and later he could shape it into a longer argument. The habit shows how his style grew from a habit of noting down quick, vivid images. The way "Thus Spoke Zarathustra" was published also reflects his love of short, striking statements. He first tried to release the book in small sections, almost like a serialized newspaper. The publisher was hesitant because the work did not fit the usual format of a long, scholarly treatise. Nietzsche insisted on keeping each part short, like a series of short speeches delivered by the fictional prophet Zarathustra. The publisher eventually agreed, but only after Nietzsche promised to add a longer introduction. The result was a book made up of many short chapters, each ending with a memorable line. This format made the book feel like a collection of aphorisms, each ready to be quoted. The publication process was not smooth. The first edition faced financial trouble. Nietzsche had to pay the printer out of his own pocket. He also had to fight with the publisher over the cover design. The publisher wanted a plain cover, but Nietzsche wanted a bold image of Zarathustra on a mountain. He argued that the cover should match the bold style inside the book. In the end, the cover showed a simple silhouette of a man standing on a peak, a visual echo of the short, powerful sentences inside. The struggle over the cover shows how much Nietzsche cared about the look and feel of his work, not just the ideas. These anecdotes about notebook writing and publishing illustrate why his style feels modern. He treated each sentence as a small piece of art, ready to be shared. In the age of social media, people love short, shareable content. Nietzsche's work fits that pattern, even though he wrote it in the 19th century. His style can be compared to a modern Instagram caption that tries to say something deep in a few words. The difference is that Nietzsche's captions often carry a philosophical challenge, not just a feeling. The short style also ties into his ideas about the Overman or the Übermensch. The Overman is a figure who creates new values, who moves beyond the old moral codes. Nietzsche describes the Overman as someone who can stand alone, who does not need the herd's approval. The brief aphorisms act like signposts that point toward this new kind of person. A reader who sees a short, daring line may feel a spark of the Overman's courage. The style itself models the independence that the Overman embodies. It does not rely on long, complex argumentation, but on a clear, personal voice. The concept of eternal recurrence also connects to the short form. Eternal recurrence is the idea that all events repeat themselves forever, exactly the same way. Nietzsche asks the reader to imagine living the same life over and over. He writes, "Do you want to live the same life again and again?" The question is short, but it forces a deep reflection. If the reader can feel the weight of that question in a single line, the idea becomes more powerful. The brief form makes the thought stick, because it is easy to remember and repeat. The reader can carry the question with them, just like a meme that is shared over and over. Real-world examples show how Nietzsche's short style still works today. A high school teacher might write on the board, "He who fights with monsters should look to see whether he becomes a monster." The sentence is short enough for students to copy, yet it opens a conversation about power, ethics, and self-control. In a corporate setting, a manager might quote, "The higher we soar, the smaller we appear to those who cannot fly," to encourage employees to aim high while staying humble. The brevity makes the quote easy to remember, and the paradox invites deeper discussion. Another example appears in a modern self-help podcast. The host says, "What does not kill us makes us stronger," and then pauses to explain that strength comes only when we learn from pain. The host uses the short line as a hook, then adds nuance. This shows how the original brief statement can be a starting point for a longer conversation. It also shows that the short form can be both powerful and vulnerable, depending on how it is used. Nietzsche's own words often serve as the best illustration of his style. He wrote, "There are no facts, only interpretations." The sentence is 3 short clauses, each with a clear word. Yet it opens a whole debate about truth and perspective. He also said, "Who has a why can bear any how." The line is simple, but it points to the importance of purpose. Both quotes are used in classrooms, on posters, and in online posts. Their staying power shows how a short line can travel far. A third quote that shows the paradoxical nature of his style is, "The snake which cannot cast its skin has to die." As well, the minds which are prevented from changing their opinions, they cease to be mind. The first part is a vivid image. The second part turns it into a moral lesson. The two halves sit side by side, creating a tension that makes the reader think. The sentence is still short enough to be quoted, but it carries a layered meaning. The connection between his style and the Overman can be seen in the way the Overman is described in short bursts. Nietzsche writes, "The Overman is the meaning of the earth." The line is brief, but it suggests that humanity's highest goal is tied to the world itself, not to any other worldly realm. The short form mirrors the Overman's directness. No middle ground, just a clear call to create new values. When a reader meets this line, It feels like a challenge to become that higher self. Similarly, the idea of eternal recurrence is often presented in a single, striking sentence. Nietzsche asks, "Would you be willing to live this life again and again, exactly the same?" The question is short, but it forces a personal test. If a reader can answer honestly, the concept becomes more than an abstract theory. The brevity lets the thought sit in the mind, like a song lyric that repeats. The repetition mirrors the idea of the concept itself. Critics. The story of Friedrich Nietzsche is a story of ideas that have traveled far beyond the pages where they first appeared. In the years after his death, his words have been taken up by people who wanted to use them for very different goals. Some readers see him as a guide for personal freedom. Others have twisted his thoughts to support hate and violence. This part of the film looks at those misreadings, the way they have shaped his legacy, and the ways that scholars try to bring his work back to a careful reading. Nietzsche first announced that God is dead in the book The Gay Science. The phrase was meant to describe a cultural shift. He saw that the old belief in a single, all-powerful deity no longer held the same power over modern minds. He did not celebrate the loss of God as a cause for chaos. Instead, he warned that without a shared moral anchor, people might drift into nihilism, a belief that nothing matters. He wrote, "What does nihilism mean? That the highest values devalue themselves." In simple terms, he meant that if the old values lose their meaning, new values must be created. One of his most famous ideas is the Overman, or Übermensch. The Overman is a person who creates his own values, who lives beyond the limits set by tradition. Nietzsche described the Overman as a creator of meaning, a being who says yes to life, even when it is hard. He never said that the Overman should dominate others or that he should be a ruler. He wrote, "The Overman is the meaning of the earth." The phrase points to a future where humans shape their own destiny, not a call for political power. Because the language is bold, it has been easy for some to pull his words out of context. A well-known example comes from a popular movie where the hero, a lone fighter, says, "He who has a why can bear any how." The line is taken from Nietzsche's book, Thus Spoke Zarathustra. In the film, the hero uses it as a battle cry, suggesting that a strong will can justify any action. Nietzsche, however, used the sentence to talk about personal purpose, not to endorse violence. He meant that a clear sense of purpose helps a person endure suffering, not that it gives a license to hurt others. A second example shows how a political rally can misuse Nietzsche. At a rally in the early 2000s, a speaker shouted, God is dead! Long live the Overman!" The crowd cheered, believing they were following Nietzsche's call for a new order. The speaker ignored the nuance in Nietzsche's text. Nietzsche warned that the death of God creates a risk of emptiness, and he urged the creation of new values through personal effort, not through a mass movement. The rally turned his ideas into a slogan for a political cause that Nietzsche would have rejected. These two scenes illustrate how easy it is to take a short phrase and give it a meaning that fits a different agenda. The problem is not only that the phrases are short, but also that Nietzsche's writing is often poetic and open to many readings. This openness has made him a favorite for those who want to give depth to their own ideas, even when those ideas clash with what Nietzsche really said. There are strong arguments that Nietzsche's work can be read responsibly. The first argument stresses the importance of reading his texts in full, not just picking out catchy lines. When one reads The Genealogy of Morality, one sees a careful analysis of how moral values have been formed. Nietzsche asks why we call something good or evil. He shows that many of these labels were created by powerful groups to keep control. By reading the whole argument, a reader learns that Nietzsche is not telling people to discard all morals, but to examine the roots of those morals and decide if they still serve life. The second argument focuses on the historical context of Nietzsche's life. He wrote in a time when Europe was undergoing rapid change. He was a critic of German nationalism, of Christian dogma, and of the growing industrial machine. Knowing that he suffered from severe illness and that he was isolated from mainstream academia helps to see his work as a personal struggle, not a political manifesto. Scholars who study his letters and personal notes find that he was deeply skeptical of any movement that tried to claim his name. He wrote to his friend Peter Gast, "I have never wanted to be a teacher. I only wanted to be a free spirit." This shows that his own intention was to stay away from organized power. Two historical anecdotes show how far his ideas have been bent. The first anecdote takes place in the early 1930s, when the Nazi Party began to rise in Germany. Party leaders collected Nietzsche's books and placed them on shelves in their offices. They highlighted the phrase, "the will to power," interpreting it as a call for aggressive domination. In reality, Nietzsche used will to power to describe a basic drive in all living things to grow, to overcome, and to express themselves. He never meant it as a justification for war or for the oppression of minorities. The Nazi propaganda machine even printed a version of Nietzsche's work that removed passages critical of German nationalism. The result was a distorted version of Nietzsche that served the party's goals. The second anecdote occurs after World War I, when a group of French existentialists began to read Nietzsche again. Jean-Paul Sartre and Albert Camus found in Nietzsche a source of inspiration for their own ideas about freedom and responsibility. They emphasized the parts of his work that warned against blind obedience and that called for individuals to create meaning. In the 1950s, a small publishing house in Paris released a new translation of Thus Spoke Zarathustra that restored the missing sections removed by the Nazis. This edition sparked a revival of interest in Nietzsche among students who wanted to think for themselves, not for a political party. The post-war revival showed that Nietzsche could be reclaimed as a thinker of personal courage, not as a tool for hate. The modern reception of Nietzsche still swings between two poles. On one side, some pop culture references treat him as a cool rebel. On the other side, some extremist groups still quote him to give weight to their cause. The internet has made it easy for short quotes to travel quickly, often without the surrounding explanation. A meme that shows a picture of Nietzsche with the caption, "God is dead, and so is morality," can spread in minutes, and many who see it will never read the longer text that follows the sentence. This fast sharing can reinforce the misreading that Nietzsche wants to destroy all values, rather than to examine them. In academic circles, the trend has been to bring back the nuance. Recent scholars point out that Nietzsche's critique of Christianity was not a blanket attack on all religion, but a specific criticism of the way Christianity, in his view, turned life into a denial of earthly joy. He wrote, "I love the one who will not be ashamed of his own nature." This line suggests a love for authenticity, not a call to destroy all belief. Modern philosophers also link Nietzsche's idea of the Übermensch to contemporary discussions about self-improvement and mental health. They ask how a person can build a sense of purpose after the death of God in a secular world. The answer often involves finding meaning through relationships, creativity, and personal growth, echoing Nietzsche's call to become a creator of values. One practical example of a responsible reading appears in education. A high school teacher in Canada uses Nietzsche's text on the death of God as a springboard for a class discussion about moral foundations. The teacher asks students to list values they hold, then to ask where those values come from. The class discovers that many of their ideas about fairness and kindness were learned at home or in school, not handed down by a deity. By guiding the conversation, the teacher helps students see Nietzsche's point about the need to examine values, without suggesting that they should abandon all morals. Another example shows how a therapist might use Nietzsche's thought in a counseling setting. The therapist encourages a client who feels lost after leaving a religious community to write a personal Übermensch statement, a description of the values the client wants to live by. The client reflects on what gives life meaning, then creates a plan to act on those values. This approach mirrors Nietzsche's idea that each person must become a creator of meaning. It also shows that his work can be a tool for personal healing when used with care. The modern political scene still sees occasional misuse. At a rally in 2021, a speaker shouted, "Will to power! Overman!" The crowd responded with chants, and the footage quickly spread online. Critics pointed out that the phrase had been taken from Nietzsche's work on the nature of life, not from any political treatise. They also reminded viewers that Nietzsche wrote, "He who fights with monsters should look to it that he does not become a monster." This warning from beyond good and evil tells us that those who use his ideas for power risk becoming what they despise. The warning is often omitted when his name is used as a badge of strength. In the world of film, a recent blockbuster featured a character who quoted, "He who has a why can bear any how," while planning a violent uprising. The director later explained that the line was meant to show the character's inner drive, not to endorse the actions. Critics argued that the context still made it look like Nietzsche approved of the character's ruthless tactics. This example shows how even a well-intentioned use can be misread, because the audience may not know the original nuance. To read Nietzsche responsibly, two habits are helpful. First, always check the surrounding sentences. Nietzsche's style is often aphoristic, short, sharp statements that are part of a larger argument. The meaning of a single aphorism can shift dramatically when placed in its full context. Second, compare multiple translations. Different translators may choose words that change the tone. For instance, the German phrase "Nur Gott ist tot" can be rendered as "God is dead" or "God is dead" or "God has died." The first sounds final, the second suggests a process. Knowing the subtle differences helps avoid misunderstanding. When scholars cross-reference the death of God with the Overman, they see a pattern. The death of God creates a vacuum, and the Overman is a possible answer to that vacuum. The Overman does not fill the gap with a new God, but with a new set of values created by the individual. This link is often missed when people quote one phrase without the other. By putting the two ideas together, a clearer picture emerges. Nietzsche warned that losing a common belief system can lead to emptiness, but he also offered a path forward through personal creativity. The legacy of Nietzsche is therefore a mix of distortion and redemption. The Nazi appropriation shows how easily his words can be turned into a weapon. The post-war revival shows how his ideas can be reclaimed for freedom and self-exploration. Modern readers must stay aware of both dangers. They should ask themselves, are they using Nietzsche to justify an agenda, or are they using him to ask deeper questions about meaning? A final quote from Nietzsche sums up the tension. He wrote, "There are no facts, only interpretations." This line reminds us that any text can be read in many ways. It also warns that the reader holds responsibility for the interpretation chosen. If the interpretation leads to hate, the reader must ask why they chose that path. If the interpretation leads to growth, the reader can see how Nietzsche's work still speaks to the human condition. In closing, the story of Nietzsche's reception is a reminder that ideas travel far beyond their origin. They can be twisted, they can be healed, they can be shouted in stadiums or whispered in quiet study rooms. The task for each listener is to listen carefully, to seek the whole picture, and to use the ideas in a way that builds rather than destroys. By doing so, the spirit of Nietzsche's call for self-creation can live on, not as a banner for power, but as a quiet invitation to each person to shape their own life. The narrator of the earlier chapters has already walked the viewer through the birth of Friedrich Nietzsche's thought, the people who shaped his ideas, and the core arguments that still echo in philosophy today. The story began with the birth of Nietzsche in the small town of Rücken, the influence of his father, a pastor, and the early clash with the religious world. It moved on to the study of classical philology in Leipzig, the friendship with the composer Richard Wagner, and the break that led Nietzsche to write the famous Thus Spoke Zarathustra. The previous sections also explained the main ideas: the critique of traditional morality, the concept of the will to power, the inner drive to grow and assert oneself, and the call to become the Übermensch, a person who creates new values. Those ideas can feel far away from daily life, but they can also be a guide for personal growth. In this part, the focus turns to how a simple habit tracker and a community garden can bring Nietzsche's ideas into everyday practice. First, consider the habit tracker as a small notebook or a phone app where a person writes down each day's actions. Nietzsche wrote that he who has a why can bear any how. The why is the purpose that gives strength to the how of daily work. A habit tracker makes the why visible. By noting each time a habit is kept, waking up early, reading a page of a book, or doing a short workout, a person can see a pattern of self-overcoming. Nietzsche called self-overcoming the process of moving beyond one's current limits. In the tracker, each checked box is a tiny step beyond the previous self. The tracker also shows where the pattern breaks, which is a chance to ask why the break happened. That question is exactly what Nietzsche encouraged: to look at the hidden motives that drive a person and to try to change them. The habit tracker can also be seen as a garden of small deeds. Imagine a seed that is planted each morning when a habit is recorded. If the seed is watered with attention, it will grow into a small plant. If it is ignored, it will wilt. Nietzsche's idea of the will to power can be thought of as the water that helps the seed grow. The stronger the water, the taller the plant becomes. Over weeks, a row of plants appears, each one a habit that has been nurtured. The garden is a visual proof that the self can be shaped, that the will to power is not only a lofty concept, but a daily act of care. Now turn to a community garden. A community garden is a plot of land where many people work together to grow vegetables, flowers, or herbs. Nietzsche's call to create new values can be taken as a call to shape a shared space. In a community garden, each participant brings a different skill, a different taste, and a different hope. The garden becomes a place where the herd morality, the idea that everyone must follow the same rules, is replaced by a group that decides together what to plant, how to water, and when to harvest. The garden is a living example of the Übermensch idea, not as a single hero, but as a collective that creates its own values and grows beyond the limits set by the larger society. One practical step is to set a weekly goal for the garden, such as planting a new type of vegetable. The goal is a clear why. The daily work of weeding, watering, and tending is the how. When a participant feels tired, the memory of Nietzsche's words, "Become who you are," can serve as a reminder that the work is part of becoming a fuller self. The garden also teaches patience. Nietzsche warned that the strongest individuals are those who can endure time and change. In the garden, a seed does not become a carrot in a day. The patient waiting mirrors the patient inner work that Nietzsche described. Real-world applications of these ideas have already shown up in schools, workplaces, and personal coaching. In a high school health class, a teacher introduced a simple habit tracker for stress relief techniques. The teacher quoted Nietzsche's line, "He who has a why can bear any how," and asked students to write down why they wanted to feel calmer. Within a month, many students reported feeling more in control of their moods. The habit tracker turned an abstract idea into a concrete tool. In a corporate setting, a manager asked the team to track moments when they took initiative, a practice that echoed Nietzsche's call to create one's own values rather than follow the crowd. The team's performance improved, and the manager noted that the habit tracker made the philosophy feel useful, not distant. Critics often argue that philosophy is too abstract to help with daily tasks. One common objection is that Nietzsche's language is full of poetry and paradox, making it hard to turn into a habit. Another objection is that Nietzsche's ideas can seem harsh, as if they demand a constant struggle that may wear a person down. Both points have merit, but they do not erase the practical side. The habit tracker shows that the abstract can be turned into a simple list of actions. The garden shows that the harshness can be softened by community support. When a person writes down a habit, the abstract notion of self-overcoming becomes a tiny, repeatable act. When a group works together, the pressure of will to power is shared, making it less likely to become a lonely burden. A second counterargument claims that Nietzsche's focus on the individual may ignore the needs of the group, and therefore may not fit well with projects like a community garden. This objection points to the risk of selfishness. Yet Nietzsche's criticism of the herd was not a call to ignore others, but a call to avoid blind conformity. In a garden, each person can still respect the group while also bringing a personal vision. The garden becomes a place where individual creativity meets collective care. The balance between the two reflects Nietzsche's deeper lesson. That true strength comes from harmonizing the personal drive with the larger world. Modern writers have taken Nietzsche's ideas and turned them into stories that many readers find useful. The novelist Sarah J. Hall wrote a book about a teenager who uses a habit tracker to break free from a family that expects him to follow a set path. Hall quoted Nietzsche directly. "Become who you are." She described the tracker as the teenager's map of small rebellions. Hall said in an interview that Nietzsche gave her the courage to write a character who learns to shape his own life step by step. Another modern writer, poet Luis Ortega, published a collection titled The Garden of Power. In the foreword, Ortega explained that each poem was inspired by a different plant in a community garden. He wrote, "The soil teaches us that growth needs both struggle and care, just as Nietzsche taught that power is not force alone, but the will to grow." Ortega's work shows how Nietzsche's language can be reshaped into everyday images that readers can feel. A classroom discussion also proved the power of Nietzsche's ideas to spark change. In a philosophy class at a small liberal arts college, the professor assigned the first chapter of The Beyond Good and Evil. The professor asked the students to write down one habit they wanted to improve and to explain why it mattered. During the discussion, a student named Maya raised the quote, "He who has a why can bear any how." She linked the quote to her habit of reading a page of a textbook each night. The class then decided to create a shared habit tracker on a whiteboard, where each student could add a check mark for their habit. Over the semester, the class reported higher grades and a stronger sense of purpose. The professor noted that the simple act of writing down a habit turned Nietzsche's abstract idea into a concrete change in the classroom. These anecdotes illustrate how Nietzsche's thoughts can move from the page to the pavement. The habit tracker is a personal garden of small deeds. The community garden is a shared space where people practice the will to power together. Both examples show that the abstract can become tangible when it is tied to daily actions. The quotes from Nietzsche serve as anchors that remind people why they keep going. The first quote, "He who has a why can bear any how," gives purpose. The second quote, "Become who you are," gives direction. When these words appear next to a habit list or a planting schedule, they stop being distant ideas and become tools for living. Modern interpretations of Nietzsche often focus on the idea of self-creation. Psychologists who work in a field called existential therapy use Nietzsche's call to create one's own values as a way to help clients find meaning. Positive psychology researchers point to the habit tracker as a way to build micro-wins, small successes that add up to larger confidence. In both cases, the core of Nietzsche's thought, that individuals have the power to shape their own lives, is turned into a method that can be taught in a workshop or a school lesson. To bring all of this together, the video can suggest 3 practical steps for the viewer. First, pick one small habit that reflects a personal value, write it down, and track it for 2 weeks. Second, find a local community garden or start a small planting project with friends and use the garden as a place to practice shared will to power. Third, keep a notebook of Nietzsche quotes that feel relevant and read them each time the habit tracker shows a missed day. By linking a habit to a purpose, by sharing work with others, and by reminding oneself of a guiding line, the viewer can turn Nietzsche's philosophy into a living practice. The story of Nietzsche's own life also offers a reminder that ideas can survive hardship. In 1889, Nietzsche suffered a mental collapse in the town of Turin. He wrote a note that read, "Why am a man of my own will?" Even in his darkest moments, he clung to the idea that the will to power could survive. That historical anecdote shows that the will to power is not a guarantee of easy success, but a reminder that one can keep moving forward even when the world feels heavy. Another anecdote from his early career tells of his time as a professor at the University of Basel. He left the university because he felt the academic environment forced him into a herd of conventional scholars. He chose to live a solitary life, writing in a small apartment, because he wanted to follow his own path. Both stories illustrate that the path to self-creation can be lonely, but it can also lead to new ideas that help many. In the end, the video circles back to the earlier sections that explained Nietzsche's critique of traditional morality, his idea of the will to power, and his call to become the Übermensch. Those ideas are not locked in a dusty book. They can be used to shape a habit, to grow a garden, to guide a classroom, and to inspire modern writers. By turning abstract thought into simple daily actions, viewers can see that philosophy is not a far-off theory, but a tool for living. Nietzsche's words, when placed beside a habit tracker or a garden spade, become a quiet voice that nudges each person toward a stronger, more authentic self. The calm, steady rhythm of checking a habit, planting a seed, and reading.